You look at the Christian world and you see a lot of wackiness, whether it be people in America speaking in tongues or people in Europe mixing up Christianity with the occult, or people in Utah believing that after they die, they will become a god and have sex with their heavenly wives for all of eternity. There's a lot of wackiness. A lot of it. In America, we have people who claim to speak in tongues, and speaking in tongues sounds something like this: shudda bada hunda, shudda bada hunda, shudda bada hunda. And then they will have someone who claims to be an interpreter, because when they speak in tongues, when they're saying that they should have bought a Honda, they actually claim that it is the language of the angels. So they will have an interpreter come along and translate should have bought a Honda as if it were a real language. And then you have people who say, well, after I die, I'm going to become a god and me and my wife are going to have sex forever. Or it could be me and my wives, if this is a Mormon polygamous marriage, and they're going to have sex forever and they're going to produce spirit children that will live in another planet like Kolob. It's wackiness. And these people will claim Christianity. And then you have people who are smoking weed for Jesus, or they are smoking magic mushrooms and talking with angels, and they will claim Christianity. It's wackiness. I remember going to Europe and walking into this centuries-old church only to see a statue made of gold depicting a pope. It was built in honor of a pope. And they said, oh, this was a pope who lived, centuries ago. And then I saw numerous other statues made of gold depicting popes from a long time ago. And you're like, a statue made of gold to honor a pope. And these were people who claimed to have worshipped a man named Jesus who rode on a donkey. So some guy rode on a donkey, and they think it's okay to depict themselves as golden statues. It's insane. Because when you look at Christianity, you have very, very small books, 4 very small books called the 4 Gospels, and then you have some letters written by Paul, and then you have 2 very, very, very short letters written by some red-skinned Middle Eastern guy named Peter. Now, his original name was Haifa. That's how you would have pronounced his name, Haifa or Hifa. I'm not even certain if I'm pronouncing it correctly. If I'm pronouncing it correctly, but we call him Peter in the Anglo world. But he was a Middle Eastern fisherman who lived in some village that nobody cares about, or nobody cared about at that time, at least. And he was some Middle Eastern fisherman who followed Jesus, and he would eventually get crucified upside down. Because he saw Jesus, he followed Christ, he said, this is the Messiah of Israel. And then the Jewish religious establishment had Jesus crucified. They nailed him onto a cross. And then Peter goes out and he preaches. He preaches to the Jews. He preaches to the pagans. And then eventually he gets arrested, brought to Rome, and he gets sentenced to death. Why? Because he was preaching Jesus Christ. And he was telling people that Jesus Christ is divine. Well, you can't call a man divine, a man who's not this. Well, you could, but the problem was that you could have preached Jesus as long as you were not telling people to not worship the Caesar, because he was preaching Jesus as God, and the Christians refused to worship the Caesar. They refused to acknowledge the divinity of the Caesar, because the acknowledgement of Caesar's divinity was the religion, the imperial religion of the Roman Empire. You could have worshipped anyone or anything as long as you acknowledged the divinity of the Caesar. Well, this was something that Christianity was preaching against. So Peter was brought to Rome and he was crucified. And they said, okay, we're going to crucify you. And Peter said, crucify me upside down, for I am not worthy to be crucified like my Lord. And they honored his request, and they crucified him upside down. And then you had some guy named Paul. His original name was Saul, which would have been pronounced as Shaul. So another Middle Eastern guy. And he got brought to Rome, sentenced to death for the same reason, and they beheaded him. They said, okay, you're a Roman citizen, so we have to give you a merciful death. So we're going to have you beheaded. And Paul said, okay, fine, he got beheaded. And then some guy named Thomas, another Middle Eastern guy, he went over to India and he got murdered by some Brahmin priest. Some Brahmin priest was like, this man is telling the people not to worship Shiva. He is telling the people not to worship Kali. And so Thomas was murdered. And then you had James, another Middle Eastern guy. Now, the original Semitic way of saying James, I think, was something like Chamiz, which sounds kind of like Aziz, like Aziz's rug store. So some Middle Eastern guy named Chamiz, he got probably the worst death, or definitely one of the worst deaths that the earliest Christians got. He was overtaken by some crazy Sadducees, and they brought him over to the top of a building, and they threw him off the roof like what they were doing back in the Syrian Civil War. He landed, and he survived, and they finished him off by dropping a big rock on him. Yeah, this was Christianity. This was the earliest stage of Christianity's history. And you're telling me that from all of this, from some Middle Eastern fisherman from some village that nobody cared about getting crucified upside down, some guy named Shaul getting beheaded, some guy named James, getting thrown off of a roof and then crushed by a rock, a carpenter named Jesus who lived with his mom, who rode a donkey, was kind of homeless sometimes because he would sleep on the Mount of Olives. You're telling me that from all of this, you justify building golden statues of popes and speaking in tongues and taking drugs for Jesus. That is insane. That's just insane. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.